In 1942, a single cooperative of American bakers launched a brand of white bread from a factory floor in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And within a decade, that brand would stretch from the Atlantic coastline to the orange groves of Florida, baked in dozens of cities by hundreds of workers who built their entire lives around it. Walk into any grocery store in the American South during the 1950s, and you would have seen her immediately. A round-cheeked, golden-haired little girl, printed on a soft white wrapper, her eyes wide and cheerful, her presence radiating warmth, wholesomeness, and trust. That was Little Miss Sunbeam. And the bread she smiled from, Sunbeam bread, was not just a product, it was a household religion. At its peak, the Sunbeam Cooperative was baking 12.5 million loaves of bread per year in Oregon alone. Across the country, more than 40 regional bakeries carried the brand. Delivery trucks with the iconic logo rolled through neighborhoods before dawn. The smell of the ovens wafted through the streets of New Bedford, Massachusetts, so powerfully that school children on field trips would go silent when the bus turned onto Coffin Avenue, not from discipline, but from pure, involuntary awe. Sunbeam bread was not just food. It became a cultural touchstone. U.S. soldiers in Vietnam joked about being members of the Little Miss Sunbeam Club because the brand advertised bread with no holes. And men without bullet wounds considered themselves members. That is the kind of saturation only the greatest brands in American history ever achieve. Then something began to shift. Not overnight, not dramatically, but quietly, relentlessly. The world outside those bakery walls began to change. Health trends turned against white bread. Giant national chains undercut cooperative prices. Corporate hands passed the New Bedford plant from owner to owner until in 2005 the ovens went cold and 183 people walked out of a building that would not open for bread again. Today, the factory at 229 Coffin Avenue stands renovated into commercial space. No flour dust, no traveling ovens, no smell of fresh bread, just memory and silence. So how does a cooperative that once fed an entire nation lose its grip on the American table? How does an icon, one of the most recognized faces in the history of food marketing, become a footnote on a wrapper distributed by a shrinking number of regional licensees? This is the story of Sunbeam bread, the rise from a single bakery's ambition, the peak of an empire built on softness, freshness, and one unforgettable little girl, and the slow, if painful fall that no amount of nostalgia could prevent. Welcome inside the Sunbeam Bread Factory, where the ovens once never stopped, the bread never had a hole, and the American dream rose and then went stale. 1914, Portland, Oregon. It begins, as so many American empire stories do, with a family and a belief that something ordinary could be done extraordinarily well. Eugene F. Davidson was born in 1887 into a lineage that understood bread. His grandfather had married into the family of Linus W. Dexter, a baking legend from the East Coast credited with inventing angel food cake. His father, Abiatha Davidson, had already helped establish a Davidson's Baking Company in Seattle in the early 1900s. Eugene had bread in his blood before he ever lit his first oven. In 1914, Eugene F. Davidson founded his own company in Portland, Oregon, setting up his first bakery at the corner of Northeast 24th Street and Broadway. The early loaves bore the name Davidson's Ideal Bread, a simple white and wheat bread that the people of Portland began to trust, buy, and feed to their children. In 1918, Davidson constructed a proper brick bakery at Northeast 22nd Street in Irving, installing an 80-foot-long traveling oven that could churn out loaves with a mechanical precision that smaller operations simply could not match. The business grew during the difficult years that followed World War I. Davidson sold something that wartime America had experimented around: Liberty bread blended with cornmeal, rye, bran, and whole wheat for wheatless Mondays. But the product people kept coming back for was the white bread. Pure, soft, predictable, Davidson's ideal. By the 1920s, it was one of the largest baking operations in the entire Pacific Northwest. During the Great Depression, when businesses across America folded, Davidson's held. It even managed to expand. The company was not reckless. It was methodical, careful, and deeply connected to its region. When World War II arrived, and military camps across the country needed bread by the thousands of loaves, Davidson's bakeries operated at full capacity, filling contracts and feeding soldiers. The company was built on stability, on trust, on the idea that the people of Portland deserved the same quality loaf every single day. No excuses and no shortcuts. That foundation would carry Davidson's forward into an alliance that would change everything. In 1942, as the war raged abroad, Eugene F. Davidson joined the Quality Bakers of America Cooperative. And with that single decision, the word Sunbeam entered his world, and American kitchens forever. The cooperative had just created something that would become one of the most recognized faces in the country. But nobody knew that yet. Not even Davidson himself. What they knew was that a new brand was being born. And they were part of it. 1942. New York City. The Quality Bakers of America Cooperative understood something that most bread companies in 1942 did not. That bread was not just nutrition. And it was emotion. It was safety. It was the smell of a kitchen on a Sunday morning, the softness of a slice pressed between small fingers, the warmth that came from something baked fresh. To sell that feeling, they needed a face. They commissioned Ellen Barbara Signier, a children's book illustrator of considerable reputation. Signier was no ordinary commercial artist, and she had created the illustrations for the iconic Dick and Jane School Readers, books that had placed her work in front of nearly every child in America. She understood how to draw innocence in a way that bypassed skepticism and landed directly in the heart. Legend holds that Signier spent time in New York City's Washington Square Park, observing a small blonde girl playing on the pavement, sketching the child from life, the rosy cheeks, the bright eyes, the golden curls. Signier never publicly identified the child, and the mystery only deepened the mythology. Over the following months, she produced more than 30 original oil paintings of what would become Little Miss Sunbeam, each one capturing the same round-cheeked, blue-eyed girl in different seasonal and holiday settings. Thanksgiving turkeys, Christmas mornings, spring afternoons, all radiated the same message: warmth, health, family. The brand was first marketed in 1942 in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and the cooperative's member bakeries rapidly adopted it. The Flowers Baking Company of Thomasville, Georgia. A company founded in 1919 by brothers William Howard Flowers and Joseph Flowers, joined the cooperative that same year and began producing Sunbeam bread. By the end of the decade, Little Miss Sunbeam had appeared on radio spots, print advertisements, billboards, and bread bags from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In 1950, a magazine Enterprises published the first issue of Little Miss Sunbeam Comics, a promotional series given away to customers, featuring the mascot in full-color adventures. The comics sold for 10 cents and were a phenomenon. They created something invaluable: a generation of children who did not just consume Sunbeam bread, but felt they personally knew the little girl on the wrapper. Then in 1955, as a 5-year-old child model named Patty Michaels was selected as the first real-life Little Miss Sunbeam, making public appearances at grocery store openings and promotional events across the country. Michaels would go on to play Louisa Von Trapp in the original Broadway production of The Sound of Music. But before the stage, she was the face of Sunbeam. A living, breathing embodiment of what the bread promised to be. What happened next was not just commercial success. It was the construction of an American legend, 1945 to 1955, New Bedford, Massachusetts. After World War II ended, America entered a period of extraordinary suburban expansion. Families moved out of crowded city apartments into freshly built homes with kitchens designed for convenience. Supermarkets spread across the country. The refrigerator became standard equipment, and bread, pre-sliced, pre-wrapped, consistent and affordable, became the centerpiece of the American lunch table. Sunbeam Bread positioned itself perfectly for this moment. The brand promoted a specific baking method called the batter-whipped process, pioneered in the New Bedford operation by a baker named Joseph P. Duchesne. The batter-whipped technique produced a bread with a particularly uniform, closed crumb, what the advertising famously called bread with no holes. This was not merely a marketing gimmick. Why, it was a genuine distinction. A slice of Sunbeam bread stayed together. It held butter without tearing. It held peanut butter without sinking, and it lasted longer than the loosely structured competition. The advertising slogan, "For freshness' sake, go Sunbeam Bread," was built around a promise of daily baking and guaranteed freshness. In an era when food safety was a real concern for American housewives, that promise carried significant weight. The Coffin Avenue facility in New Bedford, which had been baking bread since 1934, became a central hub for the brand's northeastern identity. In 1951, the Davidson Baking Company in Oregon constructed a new 35,000 square foot facility in Eugene, specifically to increase Sunbeam output on the West Coast. That same year, the American Bread Company of Nashville, Tennessee, a company originally founded in 1889, opened a $1 million state-of-the-art bakery on Murfreesboro Road and began producing Sunbeam bread in 1953, anchoring the brand in the Southeast. By the time Davidson's celebrated its golden anniversary in 1964, the Portland operation alone was baking 12.5 million loaves of bread per year, roughly 6 or 7 loaves for every single person in the state of Oregon. Hence, the cooperative's annual sales across all Sunbeam licensees had climbed beyond $400 million. 40-some regional bakeries carried the brand. The Sunbeam Cooperative was not a company. It was a federation of American industry, and it was winning. Then something happened that should have signaled caution. The giants were moving, and they were bringing wallets that no cooperative could match. 1955 to 1965, Thomasville, Georgia. So by the late 1950s, the Sunbeam Cooperative had achieved something remarkable. It had turned white bread into a cultural institution. The brand was not simply purchased, it was trusted. Mothers did not wonder whether Sunbeam would be fresh. They assumed it. Fathers did not question whether the bread would hold up to a thick slice of ham. They expected it. Children did not need to be told to eat their Sunbeam. They asked for it. The Flowers Baking Company in Thomasville, Georgia. He stood as the most dynamic story within the cooperative. By the beginning of the 1960s, the Georgia operation alone employed more than 500 people and generated sales of more than $6 million annually. The company had grown from a small bakery founded by brothers William Howard Flowers and Joseph Flowers in 1919. Surviving the Great Depression, producing bread for military camps during World War II, into a genuine regional powerhouse. During the 1960s, Flowers moved aggressively. The company purchased bakeries in Opelika, Alabama, and Panama City, Florida. In 1965, it built a brand new facility in Jacksonville, Florida. In 1967, it acquired the Atlanta Baking Company, breaking into one of the South's most important metropolitan markets. To fund this expansion, Flowers went public in 1968, renaming itself Flowers Industries Incorporated, and raising more than $2 million in stock sales that immediately fueled further acquisitions. Sunbeam's marketing continued to deepen its cultural roots. Little Miss Sunbeam sponsored regional contests across the country, where young girls competed for the title of local Miss Sunbeam. In the Alabama region, a Flowers Bakery contest in the late 1950s crowned Marie Burns of the Central Community in Lauderdale County as the Southeast's Little Miss Sunbeam, a title she carried with pride well into adulthood. In New York, Flowers Bakeries held its own contests. The character had transcended advertising and entered the lived fabric of American community. U.S. soldiers in Vietnam referenced the brand with dark humor. To be a member of the Little Miss Sunbeam Club meant you had no wounds, just as the bread had no holes. That an American consumer bread brand had penetrated military slang in a foreign war was a testament to the depth of its cultural saturation. Sunbeam was not everywhere. It was inside everyone. But here's the thing. While the cooperative celebrated its golden years, the industrial landscape of American bread was quietly, catastrophically concentrating. The chains were arriving. And they had no loyalty to Little Miss Sunbeam. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. Now let's keep going, because what comes next is where the empire starts to crack. 1963 to 1973. Portland, Oregon. Eugene F. Davidson had run his Portland bakery for just over 50 years. Through unionization of bakers and truckers, through wage and price controls, through the rising cost of wheat, and the pressure of larger competitors, he had kept the operation alive. His company had grown from a single bakery at a street corner to one of the most respected regional operations in the Pacific Northwest. And Sunbeam bread, Davidson's Sunbeam bread, had become so synonymous with the company that customers simply called it the Sunbeam Bakery. But in 1967, Eugene Davidson made a decision that reflected the pressure he and other regional cooperative members were feeling. He sold Davidson Baking Company to Hanson's Northwest Bakers Incorporated. The Davidson family retained ownership of the Portland Bakery building, but the operation itself passed to new hands. Eugene Davidson, born in 1887, was 80 years old. He died the following year in 1968. The founder was gone. With the new owners of Davidson's faced an enemy that had nothing to do with Fran's Family Bakery, the Portland-based competitor and inventor of the modern hamburger bun that Davidson's had long sparred with. The real threat was arriving from outside Oregon entirely. It was the growth of enormous national chain bakeries, ITT Continental and American Bakery, entities so large they could undercut prices even as the cost of wheat was climbing sharply. With the chains operated on economies of scale that regional cooperatives simply could not replicate. In 1973, the Davidson Baking Company, the birthplace of Sunbeam bread on the West Coast, closed permanently. The plant at Northeast 22nd Street in Irving in Portland went dark. The 12.5 million annual loaves ceased. The workers dispersed. Not even Little Miss Sunbeam could save them, the Oregon Encyclopedia would later record, it with a bluntness that honored the truth. What happened in Portland was not an isolated failure. It was a preview. The regional bakery model, for all its community roots and product excellence, was structurally vulnerable to the price war that industrial-scale bread manufacturing was beginning to wage. Wheat costs were rising. Labor costs were rising. Distribution costs were rising. And the chains were not rising with them. The chains were squeezing. Meanwhile, in New Bedford, the Coffin Avenue plant changed hands for the first time. In 1955, it had been purchased by the new Bedford Baking Company. The operations continued. The bread still smelled like morning on Coffin Avenue. But the ground beneath the industry was beginning to move, slowly and irresistibly, like a tide going out. 1960s to 1990s. New Bedford, Massachusetts. New Bedford had always been a working city. A whaling city, once the richest city per capita in America, then a textile city, then a fishing port. It was a city where people worked with their hands and measured their worth in the quality of what those hands produced. The Sunbeam Bread Factory on Coffin Avenue, fit perfectly into that tradition. The bakery employed local families across multiple generations. Parents brought children in on school field trips, where the smell of baking bread enveloped the bus before it even reached the building. Workers brought home warm loaves before the shift ended. A small thrift store on Coffin Avenue near Brook Street sold bread for less than $1, and Little Debbie snack products at discount, and neighborhood families made weekly stops there as a matter of routine. In the 1960s, the bakery's workforce organized. Gil Cheros, a union organizer from Fairhaven, along with Tony Perry from Providence, Rhode Island, led the effort to unionize Sunbeam Bakery's workers. It was a defining moment for the plant. The union brought improved wages, defined working conditions, and a set of protections that meant the men and women on those production lines had leverage they had not possessed before. For those workers, the union was not a political abstraction. It was the difference between a decent life and vulnerability. The thrift store, the field trips, the union hall meetings, the early morning shifts where workers fed an 80-foot traveling oven and watched loaves emerge in the thousands. While the Sunbeam factory was not merely an economic engine, it was a neighborhood institution. People who grew up on North Front Street a couple of blocks away still remember the smell as one of their most vivid childhood memories, the same sensory memory that can snap decades of distance into a single moment of clarity. But the institutional character of the plant could not insulate it from the economic forces gathering at the industry level. In 1994, the new Bedford operation was purchased by My Bread Baking Company. In 1996, First Citizens Federal Credit Union acquired it. Then, in 1998, it was sold again to Wayne's, this time to a St. Louis-based company called Earth Grains. 3 ownership changes in 4 years. That is not the rhythm of a stable operation. That is the rhythm of something searching for a lifeline. And the people who worked the overnight shifts at the Coffin Avenue plant, the bakers with the paper white boat hats, the sanitation workers who cleaned the conveyor belts before dawn, had every reason to wonder what those changes meant for them. They were about to find out. 1968 to 2000, Thomasville, Georgia. Not every member of the Sunbeam Cooperative declined with the regional model. Some adapted, some grew. And one grew into something the original cooperative founders could never have imagined. By the 1980s and 1990s, the Flowers Industries Company, the same Georgia bakery that had joined the cooperative in 1942, had transformed itself from a regional bread maker into a national baking corporation. After going public in 1968, Flowers Industries spent 3 decades acquiring, expanding, and consolidating. The company absorbed regional brands, opened new facilities, and relentlessly extended its distribution network. Sunbeam bread remained a key product line, but it was no longer the centerpiece of Flowers' identity. The company was building something bigger, a portfolio of brands that could compete with the largest industrial bakers in the country. By 2010, when Flowers Foods, as it had renamed itself, acquired several bread brands from the bankrupt Hostess Brands Corporation, including the iconic Wonder Bread, the company had grown into the second largest player in the United States center store sandwich bread market. Its annual revenue ran into billions. Its distribution network reached 38 states, and Sunbeam Bread, the cooperative brand that had once given Flowers its early identity, was now just one of dozens of labels the company carried. The Flowers holds the distinction of being the 6th bakery in the United States to franchise the Sunbeam brand, and today it remains the country's single largest producer of Sunbeam bakery products, operating under the Quality Bakers of America cooperative license. But Sunbeam is no longer the star. It is a legacy product, a heritage label maintained because abandoning it entirely would mean losing something difficult to quantify: the loyalty of consumers who grew up with it. Who remember it from their parents' kitchens, who still reach for it out of reflex. Flowers itself, in the current era, acknowledges publicly that traditional soft white bread is losing ground. The company's chief executive officer, A. Riles McMullian, stated at a major investor conference that the traditional loaf segment, the 20-ounce honey wheats and white breads that Sunbeam epitomizes, had been declining at 5 to 6% per year. And with the company's stock, stock traded at $11.69 in early 2026, down 40 to 42% from its 52-week high. The bread category overall had declined 2.5 to 3% annually. What had once been the engine of an empire was now the weight dragging against the hull. Sunbeam bread was not dead, but the world that had made it great was long gone, 1980 to 2010, across America. Yet the catastrophe for Sunbeam bread was not a single decision or a single competitor. It was cultural. It was tectonic. And by the time the industry understood the full scale of it, the damage was irreversible. Throughout the 1980s, nutritional science began delivering verdicts that American consumers could not ignore. White bread, refined, processed, stripped of fiber and grain, was increasingly identified as a dietary villain, while carbohydrates moved from a neutral food group to a contested one. By the 1990s, consumer awareness of fiber, whole grains, and ingredients had reached a level that would have been inconceivable to the housewives of 1955, who stacked Sunbeam loaves in their pantries without a second thought. The low-carb movement accelerated the shift. The Atkins diet, which had first appeared in 1972, surged into mainstream American culture in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Millions of Americans began treating bread as something to avoid rather than something to eat. Sales of traditional white bread suffered a decline that was not a temporary trend. It was a structural realignment of American eating habits. Then came gluten. While the discovery that a significant portion of the American population had gluten sensitivities, and that many more had adopted gluten-free eating as a general health practice, created an entirely new market that traditional white bread manufacturers were constitutionally incapable of serving. You cannot make Sunbeam bread gluten-free. The product is definitionally what it is: soft, enriched, white wheat bread. In 2010, something historically unprecedented occurred. Wheat bread sales surpassed white bread sales in the United States for the first time in the recorded history of the industry. That single milestone told the whole story. The food that Sunbeam had built its empire on, soft, white, batter-whipped, fresh, had been dethroned not by a competitor but by an entire generation's changing conception of what food should be. The artisan bread movement compounded the crisis. Small, individually owned bakeries producing sourdough, multigrain, heritage wheat and stone-ground loaves were expanding rapidly. Consumers who were willing to spend 3 or 4 times the price of a Sunbeam loaf for something they perceived as authentic, traditional, and nutritionally superior were no longer available to the soft bread category at any price point. The empire of softness had met a world that had decided softness was no longer enough. 1998 to 2005. New Bedford, Massachusetts. By the time Earth Grains acquired the New Bedford Sunbeam operation in 1998, the St. Louis-based bread giant was on an aggressive acquisition campaign. Earth Grains had been spun off from Anheuser-Busch in 1996 as an independent company, and its strategy was simple: grow through acquisition, consolidate production, dominate distribution. The company was the second largest packaged bread manufacturer in the United States, with revenues of $2.5 billion and operations across more than 50 domestic bakeries. The Coffin Avenue facility in New Bedford was part of a larger Earth Grains play in the northeastern market, but the acquisition came at a price. Earth Grains also acquired the Cooper Smith Bakery in New Bedford as part of its January 1998 purchase of the Atlanta-based Cooper Smith Company. Yet the company ultimately traded that particular New Bedford facility for cash and an interstate bakeries plant in Grand Junction, Colorado, demonstrating how the regional plants were being managed not as community institutions, but as chess pieces in a national distribution strategy. The implications for workers were profound. Ownership changes at this scale and speed rarely resulted in stability for the people on the production line. The men and women who had baked bread at Coffin Avenue for decades, some of whom had parents who worked the same ovens, found themselves under the management of a corporation headquartered in St. Louis that was restructuring routes, reassigning drivers, and making decisions based on national market data rather than neighborhood loyalty. Then, in 2001, Earth Grains itself was swallowed. The Sara Lee Corporation, the suburban Chicago consumer goods giant, acquired Earth Grains for $2.8 billion in a deal that created a bakery operation generating approximately $3.4 billion in annual sales. Sara Lee was one of the largest food companies in the world. For the new Bedford plant and its workers, it meant yet another logo on the letterhead. Yet another management chain stretching further and further from the people who smelled the bread and lived in the neighborhood. Sara Lee's push into industrial bread ultimately failed. Its bakery division generated operating margins that analysts at Morningstar described as less than half those of its regional peers. High wheat prices and relentless pressure from store brand private label products eroded profitability year after year. In 2010, Sara Lee sold its North American bakery business to Mexico-based Grupo Bimbo for $925 million. Less than a third of what it had paid for Earth Grains 9 years earlier. But none of that mattered for the people of Coffin Avenue, because by then the ovens had already gone cold. 1990 to 2005, national. The threat that nobody in the Sunbeam cooperative wanted to discuss openly had a name that sounded almost innocent. Private label. In store brand bread, the generic white loaf with the grocery chain's own sticker on it, sitting on the shelf directly next to Sunbeam at a price 30 to 40 cents lower per loaf. For decades, the assumption in the branded bread industry was that consumers would pay a premium for recognition. They knew Sunbeam. They trusted Little Miss Sunbeam. They had been buying it their entire lives. The brand carried meaning that the store's own generic label could never carry. Yet, that assumption was not wrong, until it was. The shift began with the supermarkets themselves. Kroger, Safeway, and H-E-B of Texas built their own baking facilities. Other major chains contracted with industrial producers like Earth Grains to make their private label bread. By the late 1990s, grocery store private label bread had achieved a quality level that was indistinguishable from the national brands by most consumer tests. The softness was the same. The freshness was comparable. Yet the price was meaningfully lower, and the family that had been buying Sunbeam out of habit began slowly to reconsider. The math was particularly brutal for the Sunbeam cooperative structure. Individual licensees did not have the production scale of the industrial giants. They could not achieve the cost efficiencies that Grupo Bimbo or Flowers Foods achieved with their massive facilities. When private label bread pressured branded prices downward, the smaller Sunbeam operators were squeezed from both sides. Higher ingredient costs and lower price points they could not sustain. The problem compounded. Interstate Bakeries Corporation, the parent company of the brands that had long held the Northeastern production agreement for Sunbeam, filed for bankruptcy in 2004. During the bankruptcy period from 2004 to 2009, Interstate closed 9 of its 54 bakeries and more than 300 outlet stores. The workforce fell from 32,000 to 22,000. And among the operating agreements the company dropped was one particularly significant one: the agreement to produce Sunbeam bread for the northeastern United States. One by one, the structural supports were giving way. The cooperative that had once organized 40-some regional bakeries into a national brand was contracting. And in New Bedford, where the story had begun 63 years earlier, The countdown had already started. We're halfway through this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything. And the final chapters of the Sunbeam story are the ones nobody talks about. 2005. New Bedford, Massachusetts. By 2005, the Coffin Avenue plant was 71 years old. It had seen the Depression. It had fed soldiers in wartime. It had employed men whose fathers and grandfathers had worked the same ovens. It had filled the streets of New Bedford's North End with the smell of fresh bread for 7 decades, and it had weathered 4 ownership changes in a little over a decade. The decision to close it was made not by the workers, not by the city, and not by any entity that had any attachment to what the building meant. It was made in a corporate office far from Coffin Avenue by people measuring margins, routes, and the economics of bread production in a market that had fundamentally changed. The plant was not failing to produce bread. It was failing to produce bread cheaply enough to survive against industrial-scale competition and the growing dominance of private label products. When the doors closed in 2005, 183 people lost their jobs. Not 1,000. Not 10,000. 183 men and women who had made bread their livelihood, their community, and in many cases, their family's multi-generational identity. The workers who had organized with Gil Charos and Tony Perry in the 1960s. The overnight bakers with the paper white hats. The sanitation workers pulling morning shifts before high school. The delivery drivers who knew every grocery store in southeastern Massachusetts by heart. The thrift store on Coffin Avenue closed too. The smell of bread in the neighborhood, that involuntary trigger of childhood memory, that thing that made school bus passengers go silent, was gone. It did not fade gradually. It stopped. In 2006, Malden-based Lucre Development LLC, managed by Charles A. Lamarca III, purchased the 3-parcel property for $725,000. The building sat largely dormant. In 2011, its New Bedford Baking Company opened discussions with the city about a possible $8 million rehabilitation of the site to resume baking operations. A tax increment financing agreement was approved, but the plans never materialized at scale. The factory that had launched a national icon sat empty, the ovens removed, the traveling conveyors gone. The neighborhood that had defined itself by the smell of morning bread, learning to define itself by something else, or simply by absence. 2005 to present, national. It would be inaccurate to say Sunbeam Bread died in 2005. The brand still exists. Little Miss Sunbeam still appears on packaging. Still smiles from bread bags in grocery stores across the South and parts of the Midwest. The Quality Bakers of America Cooperative still owns the trademark, and approximately 10 regional bakeries across the United States still hold the license to produce and sell Sunbeam products. Flowers Foods, the Thomasville, Georgia company that joined the cooperative in 1942 as a small family operation, remains the brand's dominant current producer, holding the distinction of being both the 6th bakery to franchise the Sunbeam name and the country's current top producer of Sunbeam bakery goods. The brand generates sales figures that still cross the $400 million annual threshold across all its licensees. But the cooperative model that made Sunbeam's national presence possible has contracted dramatically. 40-some regional bakeries have become 10. The independent family operations that once formed the backbone of the network, the Davidson Baking Company, the New Bedford Baking Company, the dozens of regional producers who built their businesses around the Sunbeam license, are largely gone, consolidated into bankruptcy, absorption by larger chains, or simple closure. What survives is a brand operating in a market that has fundamentally rejected its core product. In 2026, Flowers Foods' CEO acknowledged publicly that the company had ceded the nutritional narrative to celebrities and influencers, and that traditional soft white bread, the category Sunbeam bread embodies, had declined 5 to 6% per year. The company's premium brands, Dave's Killer Bread, Canyon Bakehouse, and Nature's Own, were the growth engines. The Sunbeam was the legacy. The Cooperative's Quality Bakers of America headquarters now operates from an office suite in Allentown, Pennsylvania. It is not a baking operation. It is a brand management organization. It licenses the Little Miss Sunbeam image and the Sunbeam name to the remaining producers and maintains a marketing infrastructure. The industrial romance of the traveling oven, the overnight shifts, the delivery trucks pulling out before dawn, all of that exists now only in memory and in the recorded testimonies of former workers. Here's what nobody saw coming when the brand launched in 1942. The very qualities that made Sunbeam great, softness, uniformity, freshness, whiteness, would become in a different cultural era the exact qualities that consumers would learn to distrust. 2022 to 2025. New Bedford, Massachusetts. When nearly 2 decades after the last loaf of bread came off the Coffin Avenue production line, the building got a second chance. In May of 2022, an entity called Parallel 1260 Shawmut Avenue, purchased the 3-parcel property from its previous owner, Mariana Di Mercurio, for $490,000. The purchase price was less than the assessed value of the land and structure, less than the equipment that had once filled the building had cost new. Yet the new ownership had invested approximately $6 million in the 90,000 square foot structure. A new roof, new windows, a new sprinkler system, a new security system. The storage silo that had held flour for decades was demolished to make room for a 23-car parking lot. Inside, where the bread ovens had once burned, masons cut bricks and cleared the old installation points. Workers peered out of third-floor windows where bakers had once looked down on Coffin Avenue in the pre-dawn dark. The plan was to turn the former factory into a mixed-use commercial space, gathering space, contractor bays, possible athletic facilities including the batting cages that gave the project one of its more striking headlines. Ward 2 Councillor Stephen Martins, who had called the building an eyesore in its dormant years, welcomed the news. He remembered when the neighborhood smelled like bread every day. He understood what its absence had meant. In February of 2025, reports confirmed the building was nearing completion after a major transformation. The industrial landmark in one of New Bedford's long-neglected neighborhoods was being repositioned as a center for commerce and community activity. Yet the new ownership spoke of preserving the building's industrial character, while breathing life back into a district that had not seen large-scale investment in many years. It is objectively a good outcome. Better than an abandoned building. Better than decay. The structure that housed one of America's most beloved bread brands will survive. Adapted. Repurposed. Serving the neighborhood in a new way. But something irreplaceable is absent from that story. There will be no smell of morning bread. No overnight bakers, no school field trips where children go silent at the smell from the window. The building lives. The factory is gone. And the difference between those two facts is everything. 2005 to present. National. Little Miss Sunbeam is 83 years old. She has never aged. She has never changed her dress. She has never stopped smiling. She appears today on bread bags, on holiday billboards and Sunbeam markets, and on digital renderings for online packaging and social media content. The Quality Bakers of America Cooperative actively maintains the character, and Flowers Foods deploys the image on holiday packaging and point-of-sale materials across its distribution territory every year. The cultural reach of the character is genuinely remarkable given how dramatically the production infrastructure beneath her has diminished. She is one of the most recognizable faces in the history of American food advertising, alongside Tony the Tiger, the Pillsbury Doughboy, and the Morton Salt Girl. She has appeared in vintage advertising collectors' markets, in nostalgia publications, in retrospective features on American brand history. the original oil paintings Ellen Sainer produced in 1942 and the early 1950s are now sold as collectibles and archive pieces. A 1953 original Seigneur gouache painting of Little Miss Sunbeam, recently listed as an artifact of American commercial art history. Patty Michaels, the 5-year-old who became the first real-life Miss Sunbeam in 1955 and went on to appear in The Sound of Music on Broadway, died in 2010 at the age of 60. The character she had briefly embodied outlived her. Though the cooperative's current digital presence attempts to blend the warmth of the original character with modern brand relevance. Quality Bakers of America maintains a website and social media presence that celebrates Little Miss Sunbeam's history while promoting its surviving licensee network. The approach is essentially preservationist. Maintain the image's emotional resonance with consumers who have generational attachment to it, while gradually introducing the character to younger audiences who may not have grown up with her. Whether that strategy is sufficient to sustain the brand through another generation is a question the industry has largely already answered. The trend lines for traditional soft white bread in the United States point in one direction only, and they have pointed that way for 15 years. Premium brands, organic labels, gluten-free products, keto-friendly loaves, these are the growth categories. Traditional soft white bread is the declining category, and Sunbeam bread, for all the warmth that Little Miss Sunbeam still generates on packaging, is the product most associated with the category that the market has left behind. The little girl on the wrapper is still smiling. She always will be. But the empire she once fronted, the ovens, the trucks, the neighborhood smells, the 12.5 million annual loaves, those exist now only in memory. And memory is the most fragile thing a business can rest its future on. Stand on Coffin Avenue in New Bedford today. The building at 229 is being renovated. Fresh windows, clean brickwork, signs of commerce returning to a district that had waited too long for investment. If you look closely at the old stonework, you can still find the outlines of where the loading bays used to be, where the delivery trucks backed up before sunrise to take warm loaves into a sleeping city. Yet the smell is gone. That is the first thing the people who grew up on this street will tell you, the thing you cannot renovate back. You can replace windows and repair roofs, but you cannot bake memory back into the air. What happened to Sunbeam bread teaches 3 things that every business operating today would do well to engrave somewhere permanent. The first is that identity is not a substitute for structure. Sunbeam bread built one of the most powerful brand identities in American food history. Little Miss Sunbeam was beloved across generations, embedded in military slang, celebrated in comic books, represented by real children who became actors. That identity was real and it was earned. But it was built on top of a cooperative structure composed of regional family bakeries that were structurally incapable of competing with the industrial scale and pricing power of the national chains that arrived in the 1960s and 70s. Emotional equity could not substitute for cost competitiveness. When the price war came, the cooperative's members fell one by one. The second is that the product that made you great can become the liability that ends you. The batter-whipped, in no-holes, soft white loaf that Sunbeam perfected was precisely what American consumers wanted in 1955. It was exactly what they did not want in 2005. The brand had no architectural flexibility. It was built entirely around a product category that a generation's changing relationship with food was about to systematically abandon. By the time the health movement had established itself, the artisan bakers had arrived and the gluten-free market had exploded. There was no version of Sunbeam bread that could serve those consumers. The brand was trapped inside its own excellence. The third is that ownership stability is not a luxury. It is the foundation of everything else. The New Bedford plant changed hands 4 times in 11 years. Each transfer added distance between the decisions being made and the community bearing their consequences, The workers at Coffin Avenue did not fail. The bread did not fail. Yet the management chain that stretched from New Bedford to St. Louis to Chicago simply could not assign the necessary value to a regional factory that fit poorly into a national optimization model. From 1942 to 2005, 63 years of bread. At its peak, 40-plus regional bakeries, over $400 million in annual sales. And then, 183 people standing in the cold on Coffin Avenue for the last time. What remains is the image of a golden-haired girl still smiling from a bread bag in a world that has mostly moved on. She is the last thing standing from an empire built on morning warmth and the smell of something real. The question she puts to every business still operating today is the same one the Sunbeam Empire could not answer in time. What happens when the world changes and you do not?